Good morning. It's good to see everyone here today. As we have people walking in, I am filling in for Scott. Scott is up with his new grandbabies up in Oregon. It was kind of a last-minute trip, but I'm sure he's glad to be there. So I'm going to be filling in for you this morning. And for those that are visiting with us, we're glad that you could be here with us. We had a great singing last night. That was just fantastic. Really enjoyed every moment of that. So let's go ahead and go to God in prayer before we begin our study. Almighty God, we come before you this morning. We're so thankful that we have the privilege of coming together freely, coming together with other Christians, encouraging each other, and looking to your word. Lord, as we read your word and we read from the book of John, we're reading about the life and death of your Son, and as we read these things, help us to understand the meaning to us personally. Help us to understand what you would want us to know, but not just to know, but to apply in our lives. We're thankful for your Gospels and for the wisdom and for the life of Jesus that amazes us. And each time that we study and read it, we see things that we may have not seen before. And we appreciate Jesus as he was here on earth as much as we appreciate him now reigning. And we thank you for this study and for those that are here today. We pray all these things, Lord, in your Son's most holy name. Amen. If you haven't been with us, go ahead and open your Bibles this morning to John chapter 18. To John chapter 18. As we study the book of John, we've gotten to that point where we're looking at the end of the life of Jesus, and there's so many things to unpack, and sometimes there's things in the book of John that we see that are a little bit different than the other Gospels, and a lot of things not just to understand, but even to absorb as we take a look at the end of the life of Jesus. When I look out, and I know for all of you, we've all have experienced the death of a loved one, someone that we care deeply about. And perhaps if you've lost someone, you know the experience of just the last moments that you may have with that loved one. I'm reminded of some precious moments that I had last year with Londa's dad. He passed away, and we had some rare moments where he knew he was going to die. He was very much able to talk and very much at peace, and we had a long, last conversation, if you will, to talk about not just his life, but where he was going. And I'll never forget that conversation and the things that we had the opportunity to talk about. What a privilege it was to be there. Some of you may have experienced that. When I think about John, John had that experience, didn't he? And when we read the book of John, I like to think about what's going on with him. Later, we're going to see John at the foot of the cross. And we're going to take the Lord's Supper later during our worship service, but I can just imagine John in the years following the death of Jesus every first day of the week. Can you imagine? He was there to witness it. He was there to see his death. It also makes me think about the people that stayed with Jesus when things got tough, because we're going to see here in a moment as we get back in the text, things are getting tough. This is when people start to disappear. When Jesus fed people, how many people were around? Thousands, right? When Jesus feeds people, there's thousands of people there. When he's teaching the gospel earlier in the book of John and the other gospels, hundreds, if not thousands, were there to hear. How many close associates or apostles did he have? Well, he had 12, and one of them betrayed him. And so this group gets smaller as things get more difficult. The Gospels seem to tell us that there were 3 that were with him on a couple of occasions that seemed a little bit closer. Who were they? John being one, probably John since I'm mentioning it. Peter was one. We read about Peter, James, and John. It seems there's at least an occasion where they were there. But later, when it comes to the foot of the cross, it's John is there with some other disciples. And of course, the mother of Jesus and others. And so I think about that as we think about what we're looking at here in the book of John, chapter 18. And so we left off when Scott was teaching in John 18, and we had already read verses 18 verse 1 through 11 in chapter 18 of the betrayal and arrest of Jesus. And we started getting into Jesus before Annas and Caiaphas. And so we're now really in the betrayal and now the trial of Jesus. So let's just go ahead and read the first few verses of that section again, just to kind of set the stage. So it says, "So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the priest that year. It was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people." We read this last week, but just what stands out to you in verse 12 as far as they come get Jesus and what do you do? Okay, he's bound. Have any of you ever been bound? Okay, no one's going to raise their hand that you've been in the back of it. Yeah, there was that one time when I was in handcuffs in the back of a car, right? Okay. Is it a pleasant experience? Probably pretty humiliating. If you're bound, if you've ever seen somebody bound, what happens, by the way, if you're driving down the street and you see a police car stopped and you see somebody bound, sometimes kneeling on the ground, everybody's stopping, everybody's looking. Boy, something really bad must have happened, because if they bound him, then he must be violent in some way, or we don't want him to get away. And so Jesus is bound. Of course, we already saw his reaction to this large group that comes. And again, they lead him to Annas and Caiaphas, and we talked about verse 14 last week, that it was Caiaphas who'd advised the Jews that it would be expedient for one man to die for the people. But that was back in chapter 11 and verse 50. Why did Caiaphas say that? It was expedient that one man die for the people. This thing's turning into a big movement. Get rid of them. And kind of ironic, though, for him to make this statement now. Just for Caiaphas to say it's expedient that one man should die for the people. It's just one of those statements that you have to know when John wrote it. He knew the irony of it, right? He's looking back to what was said, and he's like, yep, Caiaphas is the guy that said this. Let me remind you of that again, even though I said it a little while ago. Interesting. And so, what's interesting about this account of the book of John is I feel like it's one of those TV shows or movies where it says, meanwhile, and it goes over to another location, another scene that's happening at the same time. And so we see that here now in the next few verses. We're going to now shift back away from Jesus, and we're going to take a look at this account of Peter. Steve, would you mind reading for me verses 15 through 18?
15 through 18.
Yeah.
Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper, and brought Peter in. Then the slave girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of the man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves. And Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself.
So we see a couple things about Peter. Let me back up for a moment about Peter. When we read these accounts about Peter, how many sermons have we heard where Peter kind of gets bashed? Here's the time when Peter We're going to see him denying Jesus 3 times. And we've all heard sermons about it. I've been on that end as well. We talk about the negative, but let's talk about the positive for a moment. Any positives about Peter from this section? He's there, okay? We talked about this dwindling group of people. Let's remind ourselves that Peter is there. So this is the guy that earlier had cut off the ear of one of the servants, of Malchus. So clearly somebody that was bold. Others have fled. He's in the courtyard. This is somebody who is courageous. And when somebody's coming to attack him or attack his Lord, he certainly shows courage. Yes, sir.
2 questions. Who was the other disciple with him that went into the courtyard? And then the other observation I made is he would have went in if he was allowed.
Okay.
He was held back from going in.
Yeah, so that was a question I was going to ask you. So Peter is there, but he's not alone. Another disciple came along. It doesn't name that disciple. So who do you think it is? So, okay. Some would say John. Some would say John. John would often refer to himself without referring to his name. Instead of saying, I was there, he would refer to himself, whether it was the disciple that Jesus loved or something to that effect. But many believe that we're talking about John. So I go back a moment to if he was there to witness these things or in a distance, that would also give him another perspective that we're reading about here today. So that's my understanding when I hear that. It's probably John. So Peter, he tries to defend Jesus earlier. Not a good plan, but he follows Jesus with John, it appears, to the center of the action. And I just want to step back for a minute. Most of us would say we relate to Peter, right? Why do we relate to Peter? We react without thinking, and we all may pick different things. We jump, the emotions there. Yes?
I think in other respects, we like to hope that if it came down to it and we were required to die for what we believe in, you hope you have that strength to do that. But in your mind, you're also thinking, could I, if faced with that type of situation, would I do the same thing with Peter? And so to me, he's human. He makes his mistakes just like we do. So that's why we can relate to him.
I think we relate to his humanity. He tends to speak based on his emotion. But the other thing that kind of jumps out at me, how many of you would say if Christianity or our church was under attack, we would go down in a blaze of glory fighting for the truth, fighting for the Lord? Do we all feel that way? Do you ever feel that way? We would go down in a blaze of glory. Absolutely. Dan Walker told a story years ago, and I don't know if it was just a story or a real account to illustrate this, but the story was in Eastern Europe in the depths of communism when it was hard to meet as Christians in a church. And as the story goes, there was a small church, and they were meeting. In the middle of their church service, many armed soldiers walked into the church, stood in the front, all holding their machine guns, and basically said something to the effect of, those of you that really believe in Jesus, stay. Those of you that don't, leave. Probably 90% of the people left the room. And as the story goes, and I don't know if it's true, but it's sure a cool story, the soldiers put down their machine guns, took off their jackets, and said, we wanted to worship with some real Christians who really believed, didn't just say that they believe. And now, again, I hear that story and I think, yeah, we would have been among the 10%, right? We wish. And I say that because here we are, this blaze of glory, or I would pick up my gun and fight for Jesus, or I would do this, I would do that. But when is it that we fail the most? It's not in that moment where it's a blaze of glory and we're going to go down. When is it? It's on Monday morning talking to my coworkers, or it's on Friday night when it's a mistake or a judgment call that I make that I probably shouldn't have made, or it's at school, wherever it may be, and somebody associates me with the belief that's with Jesus Christ, and I'm embarrassed and I shirk away or I disassociate myself from it. And so it's not the blaze of glory that we sometimes imagine. And so I relate to Peter in that way, because I feel like many times that's what we're thinking. Yet here we are with Peter, and he's just like us. He's here in this moment. And I want to remember this, too, when we think of Peter, because we're going to talk more about Peter and where he failed. But with Peter, and we're going to see this later, is the evolution, and I heard a preacher put it this way, is kind of like this. You know, we're reading right now about Peter at the fire. You know, he's at the fire, he's with unbelievers, he's cozy to the world, if you will. Then we see Peter under fire. Hey, weren't you with him? Hey, weren't you that guy with the sword? The way he talks, we see in the Gospels, they notice something different. And so he's under fire, he's disassociating himself with Jesus at these moments. But what happens to Peter later? We read this knowing the end of the story. What do we know about Peter later? Peter repents, and we know we're going to see what happens with his weeping, but it's the action that he takes afterwards. And so some would say that at the end, Peter was on fire for the Lord with the things that he did. And you just have to read the book of Acts. Read 1st and 2nd Peter, looking back to this and thinking about the things that he went through. And you see a man on fire for God. You see a man on fire for his belief in Jesus and the lessons that he learned. And so it's interesting to me, in the midst of failure, in the midst of these difficult times, we also look ahead to learn some lessons. So again, going back to the text itself, this disciple, by the way, going back to the question that was asked about this disciple, I didn't note that the disciple we talked about was known to the high priest. And I think we see some details later where there's some things that John may have known that hint further that this was John when he comes into this courtyard. And again, he stood outside the door. It's interesting too. In these accounts of Peter, it's not usually a high-ranking official. Every time it's a servant or a servant girl who is noticing and questioning. This isn't like some high-ranking person calling out Peter. It's a servant around the fire just asking him, hey, aren't you one of this man's disciples? When you do it, and by the way the question is asked, it's easy to say no. It's like, you're not one of those, are you? Have you been on the other end of that as a Christian? You're not one of those that believes that, are you? It's like, if you don't say no, you know you're about to be criticized. That's kind of how she asks the question. You're also not one of this man's disciples, are you? This guy that just got arrested. I'm not. And so they're around this charcoal fire. And again, I don't know why these little details jump out at me and are interesting. It talks about the fact that they're around a charcoal fire. Is there anywhere else in the book of John that a charcoal fire jumps out in the story of Peter? Can you think of anywhere else where there's a charcoal fire where Peter is mentioned? Let's flip over to later in the book to John chapter 21 and verse 9. Just little details I find interesting. When Jesus is raised from the dead, in verse 9 it says, so when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire, already laid, fish placed on it and bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish which you've now caught. Simon Peter went and drew the net full of large fish, 153. Although there were so many, the net was not torn. This moment of redemption later is just another account that was just interesting to me. Maybe I don't know if that interests you, but just seeing those kind of things is interesting. Any comments, again, about this is the first denial that we see with Jesus, and with Peter, rather. And we see that he's standing, warming himself around the fire, but he's clearly standing with the enemies of Jesus. Any comments on that before we move on? Yes?
I just think that I didn't fully understand why he went in that. And I think he thought it was really confused. He just saw Jesus being very passively allowing himself to go. And I think he was confused and all of the weakness and he wasn't sure what was happening.
Yeah, the comment was he thinks that, or you think that he was confused and he didn't understand all of God's plan, or this certainly wasn't what they envisioned, what's going to happen to Jesus. This is totally different. Peter might have been thinking more, no, this is going to be a revolution early in the ministry, and kind of figured out later that this isn't what I thought, and so he wanted to do something about it. Are we ever in the same boat? We're in the same boat. There's times in our lives when things happen that in our mind doesn't seem to be the plan that we expected or what we hoped for. And are there times that we try to take things into our own hands and do things instead of just letting God take care of it and completely trusting Him? Good point. Any other comments on that before we jump back into the trial of Jesus? Okay. Let's go ahead and read. Let's do verses 19 through 24. Jay, would you mind reading that for us? Yes, please.
The high priest didn't question Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I say to them. They know what I say. Then he had said these things. One of the officers standing by struck Jesus with the hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If what I say is wrong, bear witness about the wrong, but if I say what is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him out, bound to Caiaphas, the high priest.
Thank you. So when we read the book of John, we read sometimes some details that we may not see in the other Gospels. And so we read a few things here that we don't see in the other Gospels, and that is this questioning of Annas. By the way, when we talk about the trial of Jesus, is it really one trial? It's multiple trials. How many trials does Jesus go through? Yeah, at least 3 just with the Jews, if you really break it up. You've got Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who's first. Then we're going to go to Caiaphas in the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin really is third, really. So that could be 3 right there. Then he's going to go to Pontius Pilate. Then he's going to go to Herod Antipas. Then he's going to come back again to Pontius Pilate. So really there's 6 different circumstances when he is in some kind of a trial. So Annas, again, what do we know Annas is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, but just to step back, why are there 2 high priests again? We talked about this last week. Why is there Annas and Caiaphas? Why is there not just one person in charge? What's that? One succeeded the other. Chris?
It was the father of the high priest emeritus.
I couldn't hear. What was that again?
It's like the high priest emeritus.
High priest emeritus.
Served his time with distinction. He is now retired.
Okay.
Retained the title.
Okay. And were you going to add to that?
It was a title that was typically given by the Romans to the highest bidder, and Caiaphas had successfully negotiated things so that in the end, I think over a 30-year period, like 3 of his sons and a son-in-law all served as high priest after him.
Yeah, this was appointment by the Romans, and Annas had been the high priest at one point. Another son by the name of Eleazar was in between. We don't read about him in the Gospels, and then we see Caiaphas. Carl, were you going to add to that?
From what I read in the past, I can remember Annas was very corrupt and got in trouble with the Romans, and they are the ones who took him out and said, "We're not going to give you this guy anymore." But Annas was also very shrewd, so he continued to work, and the Jews recognized him as their high priest, but the Romans went to Caiaphas.
Yeah, so Annas had kind of got himself in some trouble, was removed, but, to Chris's title, this, it was more than ceremonial in the way that the Jews recognized him. And so in many ways, some believe that even with Caiaphas, Annas was kind of behind the scenes pulling the strings, right? Annas, who's really in charge? Annas was recognized, at least with the Jewish laws, because that's the first person that Jesus goes to see. And what's the first thing he questions Jesus about? Two things. What's the text tell us? What are the two things he's focused in on? Okay, one is his teaching. And what else? His disciples. Why would Annas care about asking about his disciples? Why do you think? Put yourself in his shoes. What are they concerned about?
Well, that's a major reason why they hate Jesus, because he had so many disciples.
I think that might be exactly what he's asking about, is he's asking these questions and probably asking something to get an understanding of just how many and where they're at, maybe to get an idea of the magnitude of the problem. Why was he asking about the teaching of Jesus?
I was going to add, Matthew 27:18 also says, Pilate knew that it was because of envy that they delivered Jesus up. So I think that comment's really astute, that they were envious of the people who followed Jesus, and so that was a lot of what contributed to it.
It was envy. I have this feeling of Annas or Caiaphas or one of the Pharisees getting up and teaching at some point, and maybe not having a very big crowd or not a very enthusiastic crowd, and then this enthusiastic group comes back from the Mount of Olives and said, "Can you believe what we just heard from this teacher?" And they're hearing this, and they're probably envious according to what we hear there. Why would Annas care to ask Jesus about his teaching? I mean, he's been arrested.
They need the ammunition for the Roman execution.
It's all about ammunition. So why would he find ammunition in the teaching of Jesus? I mean, he taught some things that seemed pretty tame. What would he find there? What was he looking for? He wasn't looking for the truth. Yeah. Yep, Chris?
Well, I think there's also a reason to believe that as a leader of the Pharisees, he'd be looking for something that he could adapt into his own teaching. Say, okay, you're the problem, we're going to get rid of you, but I'm secretly going to take this piece of something, because they've already been well established as having kind of twisted God's word. So why not take what's making Jesus popular and try to bring it in so that they can bring back some of those people. So if they want to know how many there are, that they can bring back to their version of the faith.
He was looking for a phrase that he could use and probably pull out of context and make something else. There's a consultant that I work with sometimes, and he uses a phrase that most of my younger employees don't understand, but we'll be in a situation where something's being argued, and he'll say, "That was a Perry Mason moment." And all my younger employees, "Who's Perry Mason?" But for those of us, and that's before my time too, but I love watching the reruns. But you watch that, and what was Perry Mason trying to do? Well, you said this a moment ago, but now you're saying this, and I've caught you. That's probably what he's trying to do, but failing. He's trying to be Perry Mason, but he's failing. He's not finding what he's looking for. Did I see another hand? Did I miss? I thought I saw a hand. Okay, so he's asking these questions, and really, I think he probably is focused more than anything on who Jesus claimed to be. Because if he finds something of who Jesus claimed to be, especially if he focuses on this idea of him being the king, which we'll read about under Pilate, then you get this idea of, it's a political revolution. I gotcha. That's what he's looking for. And he's not getting anything. Who his allegiances to? And I think that had to frustrate them too, right? Because every time they tried to catch him before, he would always say the right thing and put the pressure back on them. So it is kind of funny if anybody was the Perry Mason moment, it was Jesus exemplified that with them. And they were put on the defensive. So those are moments I'd love to just... what I don't see in the Bible sometimes, if I could go to heaven and say, can you just show me a video of this? It would be the expression on their faces when Jesus had one of these moments and they're like, or they're frustrated, they don't know what to do. So anyway, Annas is here, and Jesus, I love his answer. I love his answer. What's he say? I've been open. I've been speaking publicly. The synagogues, the temple, where all the Jews come. Everything that I've been saying is in public. Now, by the way, does Jesus know the laws? Does he already know something's going wrong here? We're having I'm being questioned in the middle of the night. Problem number one, with the law. I'm being questioned directly by the high priest. Problem number two. That was actually against their laws. The high priest could not directly question, so he knew that was a problem. Number three, if somebody is bringing something against you, what do they need to bring if it's something that happened? Proof, which generally is witnesses. Witnesses. By the way, I'll just tell the story, and some of you have heard it, some of you may not. There was one time in my life that I was pulled out of a pulpit by the police. Do you believe that? I was in Madeira, and on the way there was a situation where I saw a truck way ahead throw what looked like a log in the middle of the road. And when I finally got to that section, it wasn't a log, it was a person. And the person was out of it, and so I stopped. And by the way, I was late. So I stopped, and it was not too far from the church building. And the gentleman was okay, but he appeared to be very drunk, very inebriated of some sort. And he was laying literally in the middle of the road. And so I was just trying to get him out of the road where he was in a safe place. And as I tried to do that, he began to seem to be somewhat violent. And so I tried to do that. He at least was standing when I left him, and I then went to church and began preaching. Middle of my sermon, the back doors opened, the sunlight came in. This CHP stood in the back and was standing there looking kind of awkward in the middle of talking about taking the wind out of your sails in a sermon. So I stopped and I said, "Are you looking for someone?" They said, "Yeah, the driver of this vehicle," and which the vehicle they described was mine. So everyone in Madeira is thinking, who did we get to come speak here today? So I said, they said, "We need to talk to you right now." I said, "I'm in the middle of a sermon right now. So I walk out with the eyes of the entire congregation on me to go see what's going on. They came out and they said, "We have some people here that say that you hit a person, and it's a hit and run, and that person is injured, and you've hit them." I said, "No." So I explained the same thing I said to you, and they said, "Well," I said, "just ask him." "Well, he's passed out. He can't talk." I said, "Okay, that witness isn't." "Well, who saw this?" "Well, there was some people at a distance, and they saw you stop, and then they saw him laying there, so they figured that's what must have happened." But none of them spoke English, so I couldn't speak to them. So anyway, then they went to my car and were asking questions. So finally they finished. I went back inside. Now imagine trying to pick up a sermon again. That was explain that to the audience. It's no big deal. I just hit some. It was an odd. It was odd, and it's probably the hardest time I've ever had preaching a sermon. Finally, they came back in. The guy must have woke up or something, and they came in and said, "All clear. We're sorry." Something to that effect. But it reminded me of the importance of evidence, witnesses, and I thought, I can't believe this. Somebody came in and was going to... And if you've ever been falsely accused of something, how do you feel? You could say crushed. Some might see enraged. Like, what are you talking... So I put myself in Jesus here, and Annas is coming in, asking him about... He's been arrested. A huge number of people come, and Jesus is saying, "I've done all this in the open. There's witnesses that you can bring in. Ask those who've heard me, what I said to them. They know what I said." Yet I don't see Jesus losing his cool. I don't see that. It says, when he said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand. I'm going back to the story I told a moment ago. Imagine I'm talking to the CHP officer and they hit me in the face and say, "No, you did it. Don't talk to me that way. I'm an officer of the law." Jesus is simply telling them what's the proof. He's talking. He could have done a lot of things, and he gets struck in the face directly. Anybody ever been hit in the face, just struck or slapped? You don't have to raise your hand. It's okay. No. The restraint that Jesus shows, and what's interesting to me is, if it were me, I'd be emotional. I'd be indignant. I'd be upset. Yet what does Jesus do? He's logical. He's calm. He simply appealed for what anybody, if this is the case, go talk to the people that I talk to. Listen to what they say. Call a witness. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Jesus knew this was an illegal situation. What would we call that today? What was happening right now? It's like police brutality today. Being treated, if it was illegal, and you're coming in and essentially treating somebody this way without any proof, without any trial. Jesus knew this. And then again, they sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest, but notice again the detail that I think it's interesting. They don't just say they sent him to Caiaphas. John adds the detail. They sent him bound. So again, Jesus is walking around like this. The same thing today. If we see someone bound on the street, we look and say, what's going on? That person must be violent. But Jesus is bound as he goes to the high priest, Caiaphas. Annas couldn't produce anything for which the Sanhedrin could condemn Jesus. And so now it goes to Caiaphas, because Caiaphas is the high priest who is designated by the Romans at least. And John didn't record what happened with Caiaphas and later the Sanhedrin, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke already described this, so there was no need to put that here. So let me pause there for just a moment before we move back to Peter again. Any comments on that? It's so impressive to see the way Jesus reacted in this situation. Mm-hmm.
He wasn't even accused of charges. There was no charges.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you defend yourself if there's no charges brought?
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like the rumor of a charge. It is what he's being accused of. They allude to his teachings and his disciples, but there is no charge or evidence. So it's actually kind of worse than being accused wrongfully. Because you're not even accused.
Yeah, yeah.
You defend yourself and you haven't been questioned or accused of something.
It would be like someone coming to arrest you, bringing you down to the courthouse, and just asking you a bunch of questions, and you're already getting slapped around, but you don't even know. They're just looking through. Let me see if we can go through your life and find something to hold you for. It's almost, you're right, that's what it seems. There hasn't even been a charge, just a ton of questions. Chris?
It's like they were trying to coerce a confession out of him, trying to draw him out to say something that would incriminate himself.
Yeah. Yeah. And the restraint that Jesus shows, I'm amazed. Let's read this section about Peter denying Jesus again. Verse 25. So we're back now with Peter. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, so they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" Notice it's asked that same way, like, "You're not one of them, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. And so again, we see Peter in this situation. It's interesting to me again that the person that brings this up is another. She's described as another one of the servants. And again, you also and what's the relation here again? A relative of the man, Malchus, whose ear Peter had cut off. So kind of a memorable moment. Now, I don't know what happened with Malchus after all this, when his ear was healed. But I have to wonder that it was a memorable moment, and maybe this person who was a relative was very much aware of what Jesus did. I don't know. Clearly, she seems to be by what is said here. Now, again, if we go back to defend Peter a little bit, when he's already very close to where Jesus is on trial. When Peter denies this time, I mean, he's in danger of being arrested because now he's being, hey, weren't you that guy? I mean, now he himself is being incriminated. Yes.
Observation. You look at Peter when he took his ear off. He had backup. He had others around him that backed him up. Then you see him following Jesus for John, as he said, he had backup. And he finally gains access in the inner perimeter, which John's no longer mentioned. He's alone. So you begin to see his resolve. Okay? No backup, by myself. I'm surrounded by people that don't have any faith. And they're taking my Lord and Savior and trying. And then the last moment when the rooster crows and Luke, Jesus looks at him. That's the bottom of the bottles.
It's easy for us to come in here on Sunday and declare our faith for Jesus Christ, being surrounded by people who feel the same thing. But when we're alone with others who don't, that's when it's hardest. But in this case, it's even worse. Imagine you're in a situation where you're going to be incriminated. In this case, there's something Peter did that he would have been probably arrested had he said, yes, I was with him. And so he stays quiet. But that's when it's hardest, isn't it? Another one of those details I wonder about, but I don't know. It always got me that Peter was even carrying a sword when that happened. You know, why is Peter? Where was his faith? Because he wanted to make sure to have a sword. One of those details I might ask again when we get to heaven: did Peter carry a sword after that? Was that the last time he carried a sword? I would think so, but it's just one of those things you wonder about. So Peter again denied Jesus, and at once the rooster crows. And we've read this account. We can read the other Gospels for the moment that he sees Jesus, and there's that look across the courtyard. And we know that in the other Gospels, the reaction of Peter. But I want to go back and emphasize again, to me the point is what Peter did afterwards. We focus on what he did when he failed. But his repentance, his response, is really what we remember Peter for more than his failure, because his story had a happy ending to it. Any other comments on Peter? Okay, let's read this next section. Now Jesus is going to be before Pilate. Chris, would you mind reading verses 28 through 32?
Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early. And they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." So Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death," to fulfill the words of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative?"
We can stop right there, Chris. That's perfect. Thank you. We'll stop right there for a moment. So, again, in the book of John, what happened with Jesus in front of Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin is not recorded, because that's already recorded in the Gospels, the other Gospels. And so at this point, it picks up after clearly they didn't have any more success with what they were trying to do. They know they can't do anything because the authority rests with the Romans to actually have the death penalty. So they go from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters, or the prefect of Judea, Pilate. Again, it's early morning. This has been going all night, these secret trials. And it says they did not enter the governor's headquarters, or sometimes called the praetorium. I don't know what it looked like exactly. This is a model that's near the temple complex. It was called the Fortress of Antoni. It was part of that complex. That may be what it looked like. There's remnants of it there today from what I understand. But he goes in there. But what I want you to notice going into this, this ominous-looking building, if that's what it looked like, is what the Jews, just notice their reasoning. What's happened tonight? They've broken their own laws, having a secret trial. They violated all these things. Why? They want Jesus dead. They're about to get to a point that they're going to murder somebody. They're trying to find some way to get that done. That's the kind of evil in the hearts of whether it be Caiaphas and Annas and the Jews. But we certainly don't want to go into the governor's headquarters and defile ourselves before the Passover, because that would be terrible. What's wrong with this? So you're willing to do all these other things that they knew were wrong, but no. That we will not go that far. Now there was reasons why, for purification. There was things they needed to do to make sure they were pure, so they wouldn't do that because then they couldn't celebrate the Passover. How ironic! How they're doing all of these things and they don't even see it, and they finally come to Pilate. Now, what we know about Pilate, boy, that's not a job anybody would want. He was the Roman governor trying to appease the Jews. He didn't understand them. Did he live in Jerusalem?
No, not normally.
He didn't normally live there. Some say he lived on the beach. Not really the beach, but Caesarea.
Yeah.
So he came over to Jerusalem, so it was only part of where he ruled, and so he had, for lack of a better term, his offices and where he would make judgments and so forth. See, I went too slow. I'll just end by saying this. When they bring them to Pilate, there's an old saying that if you can't find a lawyer who knows the law, find a lawyer who knows the judge. And they know something about Pilate. So next week, Scott will pick it up here with Pilate and the trial of Jesus. Thank you.